Certainly glad that you're here this morning. I trust you got your Bible in hand and that you're going to take and use it as we study together for a few moments. If you have time this afternoon, read through Daniel chapter 5, the section where the Lord writes on the wall and sending a warning to King Belshazzar, and we're going to talk about that tonight and the lessons that we can learn from it. Certainly we want to continue to remember everybody in our prayers, also grateful and express our gratitude to the Lord for everyone's safety and coming through the storms. I know it came close to some. We do want to continue to remember those that have been affected. If we get more information about the couple and what they need at Turkmen, I'll see if we can pass that on. I know they lost everything according to the Qazis. One of the cars still hasn't been found. And so we'll do what we can there. We want to remember Bentley, the area where he lives was hit. Not where he lived, but in that area. But they'll continue the cleanup there. As, of course, people in other places. Let's remember all of them in our prayers. We've been in a series of lessons for a couple of weeks on the subject of the tongue. And in our first lesson, we just talked about some general principles, how important it is to control the tongue, and how hard it is to control the tongue. It takes a mature man. And not only do we have to control what we say, we have to control when we say it and how we say it, and that can be difficult. And so it takes self-examination and determination. And last week we talked about the new man and what he puts off with regard to the tongue, things like lying and corrupt speech and filthy language, and what he puts on, which is language that is designed to build up and to make stronger, and the giving of thanks. And this morning, I want to turn our attention to talk about the sin of murmuring and complaining with the tongue. As we begin to talk about murmuring and complaining, I want us to begin by understanding this before we talk about sinful complaining. And that is, I don't believe that the Bible points out that all sinning, all complaining is sinful. There are just complaints. There are things that need to be pointed out where corrections need to be made. For example, in Acts chapter 6, the Hellenist widows had a legitimate complaint. Their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And so that was brought to the attention, and it was a legitimate concern. The solution put an end to the complaining. In other words, after the solution was reached, everything was fine, and the complaining, it seems, stopped. You have Psalms that are full of complaints that are taken directly to the Lord and that are preserved for you and I to learn from. And I think there are a number of qualifications of legitimate complaining that we might mention just very briefly in the very beginning. And that is complaints that are legitimate address a legitimate problem, not just something that I don't like. They're all things we don't like, or things I might do different, or my mama did different, or somebody else did different. But that's not really a legitimate complaint that's addressing a legitimate problem that exists. Non-sinful complaining seeks to correct the issue, not just murmur about it. In other words, I think the case in Acts chapter 6, there was a problem that needed to be addressed. It was pointed out and the problem was addressed. When there is a legitimate complaint, it is done for the purpose of trying to correct a problem, not just complain about it in the background. Legitimate complaining is not about me, but rather it is about God-given truth and responsibility. Such was the case in Acts chapter 6. There was a legitimate problem, but God's will was not being followed because some were being neglected in the work that was being done there. And complaining that is legitimate addresses those that correct the problem, not complain about it to others. For example, if a husband had a legitimate complaint about the wife, you know who he would address? He would address the wife with that because she's the one that is addressed by that issue. He wouldn't complain about it and murmur to it about all of his buddies and everybody else behind the scenes. So I just simply point out that every time we express disappointment or dissatisfaction with something, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's sin that's committed, because I do believe there is such a thing as legitimate complaints that need to be addressed. However, probably more frequently than not, our complaining and our murmuring is not of the legitimate variety, but rather it is of the kind that God said we need to avoid. So let's talk for a little bit about the sin of complaining and murmuring this morning. Let's begin by defining our terms. What is the word complain and murmur? The word complain means to express dissatisfaction or annoyance with a thing, according to Concise Oxford Dictionary. I like the 1913 Webster's Dictionary, who says it's one who complains or laments, one who finds fault, a murmurer. In other words, a complainer is someone that is finding fault. Somebody can have a complaint about something, not really be somebody we would characterize as being one that's just a complainer. But one that is a complainer is one that is always complaining and lamenting, trying to find fault and murmuring about something. Another word that is used in Scriptures, besides the word complain, is the word murmur. And it refers to a low, continuous sound, a subdued or a private expression of discontent. One lexicon, in defining one of the Greek words that is translated murmur, describes it as background noise. In other words, it is that noise that is made in the background, that's not in the forefront, designed to sort of stir up and keep people going by expressing dissatisfaction with things. And Merriam-Webster's dictionary said it is a half-suppressed or muttered complaint, a grumbling, a low, indistinct, but often continuous sound. And so when we're talking about murmuring or complaining, we're talking about this expression of dissatisfaction, and particularly murmuring is that sort of low, muttering background noise of somebody that's complaining about things incessantly. Somebody said the problem with complaining and murmuring is this: I can readily identify it in others, but it's a lot harder to identify in myself. I don't see myself in that way, even though oftentimes we may see others in that way. And so we have to spend some time, as 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5 said, in examining ourselves as to whether we are in the faith. Now, when you look through the Scriptures, I think we get an idea about murmuring and complaining when you see some examples of it in Scripture. There are several examples of Scripture about people that were grumblers and complainers. In fact, if this was a Bible class, and I was to ask the question, when you think about complaining in the Scriptures, who do you think about? I'd be surprised if somebody didn't say immediately, the people of Israel stand out in my mind. In fact, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 10 said that we are not to complain as some of them complain and were destroyed by the destroyer. In fact, Moses just had to deal over and over again with the people of Israel and their constant muttering and complaining really about almost everything. Let me give you some examples of that. They complained about the bitter water in Exodus chapter 15 and in verse 24. They complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And so he cried out to the Lord, and that's when the Lord told him how to make the bitter water sweet. Then you come just one chapter over in Exodus chapter 16, and in verse 2, and they're complaining about Moses and Aaron because they're hungry. In fact, they say, "Oh, that we had died in the land of Egypt, where we had the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full, and you brought us out here in the wilderness to die for lack of bread," or die assembly with hunger. And that's when God then rained bread down and fed them. Go one more chapter over. You begin to see a pattern, by the way. You go from Exodus 15 to Exodus 16. You come into Exodus chapter 17, and again they have a lack of water. God on this occasion is going to provide it for them from the rock. You would have thought after the event of Exodus 15 and Exodus 16, they would have learned that God was going to take care of them, and yet again they complained about Moses. In Numbers chapter 14, they finally made it to the door of the promised land, and the spies came out of the land, and 10 of them gave a bad report, and all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said, if we just died in the wilderness, or in the land of Egypt, or died in the land in the wilderness, one of the two would be preferable to having brought us to this to this place. In fact, in verse 29, the Lord said, the carcasses of all of you that complained are going to fall right here in this wilderness. You wanted to die in the wilderness? You know what the Lord said? Guess what? You get your wish. And because you complained and you didn't want to go into the promised land, every one of you is going to die right here because of your complaining against the Lord. It's not but a few chapters after that Korah and Dathan and Abiram complain, and they are killed by the Lord. And the very next day, the people complain about the Lord destroying those that complain. And he had to destroy some more. You just see this pattern among the people of Israel. After coming out of the land of Egypt and before they get into the promised land, they just seem to be complaining incessantly, one thing right after the other. I think we can learn something about that in just a little bit. The scribes and the Pharisees were good complainers. In the book of Luke chapter 4 and 29 to verse 23, they complained that the Lord the Lord's disciples ate with sinners. When Jesus said, I'm the bread of heaven, in John 6 and verse 41, the Jews complained against him. We don't like what he had to say. And so they complained against him. Sometimes the disciples complained. In John 6 and verse 61, they complained that they didn't understand what Jesus was saying. When he talked about being the bread of heaven, and he talked about eating of his body and partaking of it, Jesus knew in himself that his disciples complained about this, and he said to them, does this offend you? So you sort of picture the disciples among themselves complaining and grumbling about how the Lord expressed himself, and how were they offended by that statement. Then you have, of course, the ungodly men of Jude that were grumblers and complainers. One other passage in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 9 that doesn't identify specific people, but it seems to me that it might have been an issue when he said, be hospitable to one another without grumbling. And it seems that there were Christians then, like there perhaps are now, that when it comes to their duties as Christians, they grumbled and complained about what they had to do in service to God, particularly that area of hospitality. And so what we see in these passages, that grumbling has been a problem, not just for the people of the world, but most of these were God's people that complained about one thing and then another. Now I want to talk to you for just a minute about some facts about grumbling, then we're going to talk about what causes it and how to overcome it. One of the things we need to understand about grumbling and complaining is that it displeases God. God is not pleased when there's this constant grumbling and complaining about first one thing and then another, whether it's our status in life, whether it's about our brethren, whether it's about things of this world. God does not like constant complaining. In fact, in Numbers chapter 11 and in verse 1, the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, and when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. In other words, God saw their complaining. What happened? It displeased him, and his anger was kindled, and he acted on that. In fact, in Numbers chapter 16 and verse 45, this is the day after Dathan and Korah and Abiram and their crowd had complained about Moses and God. Now, Moses didn't destroy Dathan, Korah, and Abiram. God had destroyed Dathan, Korah, and Abiram because of their rebellion against his ordained leaders and their lack of humility and their complaining. But the very next day, when the people complained about their deaths, in Numbers 16 and verse 45, do you know what the Lord said to Moses? He said, get away from this congregation. I'll consume them in a moment. Just get away from them. I'll wipe every one of them out right now. And only because of the intercession of Moses does the Lord not do that. Does that not tell us something about God's attitude toward complaining? It displeases the Lord. Tell you something else about murmuring and complaining. It makes a person hard to bear. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and in verse 12, Moses is speaking to the people of Israel, and he said, how long can I alone bear your problems and your burdens and your complaints? Can you put yourself in Moses' position? Would you like a job where all you hear all day long is what? Just complaints about people. Some people do have jobs like that. But can you imagine? You know what it does? It makes it hard to bear. I mean, how many of us like to be around somebody that's constantly complaining? Have you ever met somebody, or do you know somebody that you almost hesitate? If somebody remind me afterwards, I'll fix that. But I forget about it until I come back again. But have you ever been around somebody that you almost hesitate to say, how are you doing? How are things? Because you know as soon as you utter those words, you're going to hear what? A long list of complaints about first one thing and then another, and it's hard to bear. It weighs on you. In fact, it can affect how we act. Sometimes we like to complain about the people that are complaining. Sometimes it draws us in to acting the very way that they're acting. So murmuring and complaining, the Bible tells us, displeases God. But Moses says it's something that's hard to bear. In fact, I can't deal with it on my own. Not only did he say he couldn't bear with it on his own, the Bible tells us it prevents us from shining as lights in this world. In the book of Philippians chapter 2 and 14 and 15, this is the passage that J.D. read for us in the very beginning. He said, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights. I mean, when you hear somebody complain, let me ask this. Do you ever think, I want to know their secret to life? I want to know I want to know how they live. I want what they've got. I want to be miserable about everything. We don't do that. Now, sometimes we've seen people in hard times and they always have a smile on their face and they're always looking on the positive, and we may think, you know what, I'd like to be like that. I want to know their secret. But we don't say that about people that are always complaining about things. And the point is, we can't be a light in this world if we're always complaining about stuff. How are we going to reach the person that we work with if all they ever hear us complain about is we complain about work and we complain about politics and sometimes we complain about church and we complain about how are we going to reach them and truly shine as a light when what they see in us is somebody that is discontent with everything? I think that's the point. And so the reason that you do this, the reason that you put away murmuring and disputing is so that you may shine as lights in the world. Translators New Testament translates it this way, so that no one will be able to find fault with you or question your sincerity. We need to live a life that is above reproach, and part of that has to do with doing away with constant murmuring and disputing. That's what the world does. But in a dark world, Christians need to be different, aren't we? We're to live in a way that is distinct and different from the world, and that means putting away murmuring and disputing. Tell you something else about murmuring and disputing. It is not always done in a public way. Deuteronomy 1 and verse 27, Moses said, and you complained in your tents. I take that to mean that not every complaint that they had about Moses was broadcast for everybody to hear. Sometimes the murmuring and the complaining is done in private. Do you know who hears in private? God does. Every murmuring, every muttering under our breath that complains, every muttering between two individuals, God takes note of that. And so it can be done privately. In fact, that word murmuring means utterances in a low tone of voice. It wants to be heard, but not heard by all. It wants to be heard in the tent. Sometimes it can be secret or done in privately, and it's certainly something that brings about destruction. And that's why the people of Israel were given as an example in 1 Corinthians 10. Don't complain like they complain and were destroyed by the destroyer. So what do I know? I know that not all murmuring and not all complaining is, there's legitimate complaint. Somebody said, I think it's true, complaining is sometimes legitimate. Murmuring never is. In other words, there's maybe a place to point out something that needs to be corrected, but that low muttering behind the scenes is always out of place. I know God is displeased. I can't shine as a light. What is it that causes us to murmur and complain? I mean, really, what is it that causes that to develop in the life of a child of God? And I don't know that I have all the answers, but I do think I have some understanding from the Scriptures as to why that is and what we can do to overcome it. Let me just say, selfish people want things their way and don't like it when they don't get it. And oftentimes when we're always complaining, it's focused on who? It's focused on me. The context of Philippians 2:14 is about being unselfish and focusing on the welfare of others. In fact, if you look at that broader context, that's what the passage is all about. And that's when he comes in and says we have to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling and do all things without murmuring and disputing and shining as lights in the world. Why was it that the Jews were always fault-finding with Jesus and his disciples? It wasn't because there were legitimate complaints. It was because of envy. It was about them. Do you know sometimes people try to build themselves up by tearing other people down? They build themselves up by criticizing and finding fault with others. And so sometimes it is motivated by selfishness. The teachers of Jude 16 were grumblers and complainers. And the very last statement in that verse said they were seeking some advantage. In other words, by tearing others down, they were hoping to exalt themselves. And they tore others down by constant grumbling and complaining. And so when we focus on self, we're complaining about what I have and what I don't have, how I'm being treated, how I could do better than so-and-so is doing. And so selfishness can cause us to be a complainer. When we live life centered on ourselves and our wants and our desires and what we have in comparison to others. Tell you what also causes it is a lack of contentment, discontent. Christians are to be content with our necessities, with what we have in life, with our food and our clothing. Hebrews 13 and verse 5, be content with such things as you have, as he himself has said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Do you know what you have? Be content with it. That's what the Lord said, Hebrews chapter 13 and in verse 5. We need to be content with our lot in life. Paul said, I've learned in whatever state I am therein to be content. Paul said, I've learned the secret, one translation said. It's something that we have to learn. We have to develop as time goes on. And it's not always easy to be content. And yet what discontent does is it feeds complaining. The word content means pertaining to being happy or content with what one has. In other words, I'm satisfied is one synonym for the word content. Do you know what complaining is? It is expressing dissatisfaction. So when I learn to be content with what I have and with God's way and with my lot in life, then what that does, it helps to eliminate some of that murmuring and that complaining. Tell you something else that does it is fault finding. If one is looking to find faults, they'll always find them. You know, that's true. If I want to find a fault in you, guess what? I can find it. You want to find a fault in me, guess what? You'll be able to find it because none of us are perfect. And yet there are some people that like to find faults in others. Remember our definition of the word complainer is one that finds fault. Matthew 7, 1-4. It is the attitude described there where the brother's looking for the speck in his brother's eye, even though he's got a log in his own eye. I want to tell you, if you look at me and you say, Mike, I see some dust in your eye, you have to have been looking for it. You're not seeing that from where you are. You're not going to see that by accident. If you see a speck in my eye, that's because you were diligently trying to find it. In other words, it describes the person that is trying to find fault in someone else. Not only does fault finding feed complaining, lack of gratitude. We need to be thankful with everything that we have. Be thankful in everything, give thanks. You think that fed the people of Israel? I think it did. More about that in a moment. Walking according to our own lust is what happened in Jude 16. And because they were walking by their desires as opposed to God's desire, if we're walking by our desires, you know what becomes prominent in my life? What I want. And when I don't get what I want, then I complain about it and I grumble about it. When I'm walking by God's will, then what I want takes a back seat. There's less complaining and there's less murmuring. But Jude 16, they were grumblers and complainers, walk according to their own lust. Let me just mention one other thing I think that feeds it, and that is when things happen we don't understand. I think that happened with Job. Was Job a complainer? Well, for a period of time he was. In fact, the word complain is found in all of those passages. And the thing that made Job a complainer is he was facing some bitter circumstances that he did not understand. And what Job had to learn in the end, as we make some application in a minute, is when we don't understand, we've got to learn to trust in the Lord. But the reality is, sometimes we complain when things are happening and we don't know why they're happening. We can't understand the reason. We can find ourselves complaining about our lot in life. But the main thing I'm concerned about is, how do we overcome that? You ever complain? Most of us would have to say, yes, I'm guilty at some point. How can I overcome that? How can I overcome this complaining? Maybe it helps to understand a little bit about what has caused it, but now that I know what caused it, I can go about trying to fix that problem. Let me just say, first of all, I've got to remember that complaining is against God. Exodus chapter 16 and 7 and 8, the people of Israel really complained about Moses, but when the Lord talked to them, or Moses talked to them, he said he hears your complaints against the Lord. In other words, when I'm complaining about what I have and what I don't have, or I complain about my lot in life, do you know ultimately who I'm complaining to or about? It's about the Lord. And I think when I realize that my complaining is primarily about the Lord, that helps me to try to eliminate that attitude. They saw the complaint about Moses and Aaron. God saw the complaint as being about him. And so when I'm complaining about how much money I make, you may think, well, that's a complaint. It's about my employer. You know, it's ultimately about what God's given you. It's ultimately about what God has provided for you. And so when we look at complaining, we say ultimately that complaining is directed against the Lord, then we begin to eliminate complaining. I've got to learn to focus on my blessings, and that is what is right instead of what is wrong. We often focus on what we don't have, what is wrong, as opposed to focusing on what is good. And by the way, sometimes things that are good can bring some challenges about it. The book of Proverbs, I can't remember exactly where it is, basically says, if you want a clean barn, don't have an ox. You know, in other words, if you have an ox that plows your garden and helps you to provide for your family, that's a blessing. But you know what you got to do after an ox? You got to clean the stable. And you could focus on the dirty stable, or you could focus on the fact, you know what? I've got an ox. I can provide for my family. And there are things that we need to focus on, that we need to focus on the good and the blessings and the benefits of God, as opposed to focusing on what is negative. Sometimes in almost every circumstance we find ourselves in, there's something positive that we can focus on. You know, yes, sometimes there's the worry and the concern that goes with having children, but what a blessing they are. Or there's the concern over grandchildren, but I consider myself blessed to have them, with all the concern and sleepless nights sometimes that may go with that. You know what? I've been blessed. Focus on what is right. Focus on counting our blessings instead of focusing on what is wrong. I may have sometimes a friend that may express themselves in the wrong way during times of difficulty. But I tell you what, I'm grateful I've got friends that are there when I need them, even though sometimes they may not be perfect in how they express everything. What if we focused on what's right and what is good, as opposed to focusing on what is wrong? And when we begin to do that, we begin to be more grateful, and it eliminates that murmuring and that complaining, because we're thinking about things that are good and lovely, Philippians chapter 4 and in verse 8. I think we have to develop patience. James 5 in verse 9 says, do not grumble against one another. That tells me that sometimes we complain about one another. You know what the Lord says? Don't do it. But what the verses around it are about are patient. Be patient. Before he talked about patience. Afterwards he talked about the patience of Job. You know what patience is? It's the ability to endure when things aren't just exactly what I want them to be. I know people that are like that. People that no matter what life throws at them, we would say it falls off them like water off a duck's back. I mean, they just seem to be able to take you know what that is? That's patience. It's the ability to endure when things aren't always what I want them to be, because guess what? Things are probably never going to be just exactly the way I want them to be. And I've got to learn to endure in all of that. And so we just have to keep on going. Tell you what else I've got to do is remember the judge is standing at the door. James chapter 4 and verse 9, do not grumble against one another. The judge is standing at the door. I think part of the point is that sometimes we whisper something in somebody's ear and we don't want anybody else to hear it. We've got a complaint, we've got a murmuring, and we want to do it in private, but we don't want it to be public. And I think here's the point. Would you say it if Jesus was listening at the door? If if he was on the other line, would you make that complaint? I think the point is this. Keep in mind that everything that we say, do you know who's there? Do you know who hears it? The Lord does. The judge is standing at the door, and he takes every bit of that in. Tell you something else I think we need to do. Work to improve the area of complaint instead of murmuring about it. Some things in life we can't change, but there are some areas that can be changed, and we can work on them. Murmuring doesn't help or change anything. You ever heard somebody, for example, let me give an example. We need to be content with what we have. But I'm saying when somebody says, you know what, I need to make more money, you can murmur and complain about it, or you can try to find a job that pays more. But if all you do is never try to improve things, you know what happens? Things don't change. Have you ever murmured and complained about money, and then the next day you open up your bank account and you look and go, well, there it is. All that murmuring and that complaining, guess what? It paid off. It doesn't work that way. Worry doesn't. There are some things we can work to do what? We can work to change. We can work to improve. Some things in the Lord's work that need improving, we can complain about it, or we can put our shoulder to the work and we can try what? We can try to make them better. So instead of complaining, doing what we can to improve that area of complaint, if it can be changed. Tell you something else we need to do. Remember the consequences of grumbling. It destroyed the people in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and in James chapter 4 and verse 9, he said that do not grumble against one another. The judge is standing at the door, lest you be condemned. What that means is God's taking all that in. He could condemn you for your grumbling about one another. By the way, sometimes when life is difficult, and I think that's the context of James 5, we grumble and complain about those that are the closest to us. And I think that's what James is warning about. My soul is at stake if I'm a constant complainer. And finally, let me just say this. Trust in the Lord. Do you know what ultimately grumbling and complaining is? It's a lack of faith in the Lord. Hebrews 13 says that we need to trust in the Lord, and we need to realize that he has said that he'll never leave us or forsake us. The Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? So be content with what you have. Why should I be content with what I have? Because I trust that what I have is what I need. God's given it to me. And if this is what God has given to me, then that's all that I need. I can be content with it. And I don't have to complain. If this is the lot, then God will help me through it. And when I have that kind of faith and trust in the Lord, then it eliminates murmuring and complaining. Do you like to hear murmurers and complainers? Do you like to deal with that all the time? The reality is we can often hear it and see it in others. But are you ever guilty of murmuring and complaining? Perhaps we are. If we can identify the cause, then maybe we can identify the remedy for that. Get your songbook out. We're going to be singing the invitation song, Will Jesus Find Us Watching? When we do, that'll be the proper time in this assembly for one that needs to respond to obedience to the gospel of Christ. If you're not a Christian, you can become one by being buried in the waters of baptism. If you are a child of God that has wandered away and needs to come back, you can do that as well. No matter what your need is, take advantage of this opportunity to respond right now as we stand and we sing.